Few events and objects in the history of mankind have had the potential to redirect the course of human history in its entirety. Yet when they do, they become steeped in mistrust. Every aspect is analysed, debated, and contested. It may be instrumental in shaping our reality, yet the truth itself can be lost or forgotten. As tangible fragments and anecdotes are passed down the generations, they take on a life of their own, and it is the work of later generations to untangle the facts from fiction. The Shroud of Turin is a plain and simple cloth, and is considered by many to be the linen documented in history to have been draped around the body of the prophet Jesus after being crucified. This most sacred of relics to those of Christian faith remained hidden and unauthenticated for much of its existence. For more than 13 centuries after the demise of Jesus, it mainly existed in rumours, references, and footnotes in history. Yet ever since 1390, the year of its first undoubted testimony, it has thrown up countless questions and many disputed answers. Why was it hidden for so long? How did an image appear on the cloth in the first place, and how was it preserved for such a long period of time? Can it possibly be proven to be authentic, or has it just been able to fool those desperate for validation of their faith? The Shroud of Turin is a rectangular piece of linen, approximately 4 meters long and 1 meter wide, with triangular scorch marks due to fire damage from the year 1532, and smudges along the whole length of it, echoing its turbulent and unusual past. When viewing its negative, the whole front and back outline of a man, outstretched and deeply wounded, is visible. Each limb and mark of injury can be identified. With his wounded head and bleeding hands clasped at the front, this is the picture of a man who has gone through a great torment. The details of his physical condition at the time has been preserved perfectly. This negative image was first observed when it was photographed in 1898. It was a momentous finding. To some, this shroud had always been a holy relic, but now science had provided means to its validity. The marks observable in the negative image agree to a great extent with the biblical scripture of 1800 years ago. Yet this is no proof for authenticity. What was required for it to seal a permanent and definite position in history was for science to back up its existence. One method to determine its age was to conduct a carbon dating. The process detects the radiation from a radioactive carbon isotope, C14. The amount of radiation detected indicates the age of the source, since there is a definite and exponential decrease of radiation with time. In 1978, after a lengthy discussion, a group was set up for exactly this purpose. It was called the Shroud of Turin Research Project, STURP. And finally, in 1988, the first sampling of the Shroud of Turin was carried out. The samples were sent to Zurich, Oxford, and one in Tucson. Independent tests were carried out to determine the age of the shroud. 6 months after the samples were released, a press conference was held in Turin. The results were in. After all the tests had been analysed and confirmed, the scientists had reached a conclusion. The 3 results were averaged out, and the shroud was dated to the year 1325. Finally, science had provided an answer for one of the great mysteries of the world. The shroud was proven to be fake in all regards. Or was it? The shroud had morphed from a relic and a historic artifact into a controversy and forgery in the public eye. A year later, the Pope declared that the Catholic Church was still considering it to be real. Yet for everyone else, science was to be trusted. Science was, after all, supposed to be unbiased and gave definite answers. Yet at the same time, experiments and research was already being conducted which brought the results of the carbon dating into question. What was found was a relic venerated in its own right. one that may be able to shed further light onto the history of the Shroud of Turin. Describing the events after the burial and so-called resurrection of Jesus, the Bible says, "Then cometh Simon Peter following him, and went into the sepulchre, and seeth the linen clothes lie, and the napkin that was about his head not lying with the linen clothes, but wrapped together in a place by itself." Gospel of John, chapter 20, verse 6-7. History has preserved the sudarium, a cloth used for the burial of Jesus. It is much less controversial, yet far better documented, and enjoys the distinguished position within the many artifacts related to Christianity of being accepted by scientists and historians alike to be an authentic burial cloth and not a forgery. While the dating of the shroud has been controversial to say the least, the sudarium can be dated to as far back as 570 AD. Antonius of Piacenza, a 6th century pilgrim, wrote a narrative of his journey, and in it he writes that at the time this sudarium was located near the monastery of St. Mark, close to Jerusalem. To the naked eye it appears as a stained piece of cloth, very similar to the Shroud of Turin. Further analysis of the stains confirms them to be blood and bodily fluids. The original folds of the cloth are still preserved. The sudarium has been carbon dated to at least the 7th century, and it could possibly be even older. It was extensively handled, more so than the Turin shroud, which might have skewed the results. What elevates its importance even further is the link it shares with the shroud. There are 70 points of correlations between the marks on the shroud and those on the sudarium. For a piece of cloth to be so much in agreement with another cannot be a mere coincidence. This clearly suggests that it was covering the same man with the same wounds as the Shroud of Turin. Despite the scientific tests regarding its age, there is a clear and obvious link of the Shroud of Turin to a historic piece dated much earlier than that of the shroud. This inserts some reasonable doubt into the results of the carbon dating tests conducted in 1988. Further arguments of the challenges of the results were simple. While the experiments done were done correctly and could be trusted, the sampling was not. The results could have been accurate, but the methods employed and the planning behind it had skewed the results. The shroud is an old and complex fabric. It had been damaged, handled, and repaired extensively. All 3 samples for the carbon dating were taken from the same side of the same corner. Though an attempt had been made to design an experiment which would not be biased, the reality was different. Another aspect which brought the interpretation of the result into question was the variation of results between the different laboratories. Professor Atkinson, a statistician from the London School of Economics, had doubts about the findings themselves rather than the validity of the tests.
I think I am reasonably satisfied with the tests that were carried out in the 1980s for the carbon dating. The only question really is how representative the sample was. My own work has been to do with the fact that the variability in the dating of the shroud was much higher than the variability in the dating of 3 control samples which were also taken.
According to Professor Atkinson, the very same laboratories were unanimous in their findings of the control sample, a cloth of an ancient mummy, yet when testing the shroud sample, all 3 different laboratories had varyingly different results.
There are several things here, aren't there? Presumably the carbon dating technique couldn't actually fail, so it will be to do with the sampling. And it would be interesting from a statistical point of view to illustrate that this would illustrate in fact the importance of getting a correct and careful sample. I think in recent elections in the Western world we've had ample evidence of the importance of getting a correct sample to get correct predictions of presidential elections.
The Tucson test placed the shroud to the mid-14th century, 1342. Oxford dated it to the mid-13th century, while the Zurich sample was tested to be from the early 13th century. The range between all of these results is more than a century apart. The final date for carbon dating had been reached by calculating the mean of all these results. Though this is a scientific method, it is suspect in the necessity of its use in this instance of a cloth which is less than 9 centimetres in width. Yet there were even greater problems. Part of the task of Stirp was to analyse other aspects of the shroud. The results of these tests threw up more questions than they were trying to answer.
We were primarily interested in how the image was formed, so the majority of our tests were designed to try and answer that question. So it included tests like multiple types of photography, including white light, transmitted light photography, ultraviolet, fluorescence and reflectance photography. And of course, we also did X-radiography, and we did a number of different spectral analyses. We had with us the spectral characteristics of every paint, pigment, or binder known to man from medieval to modern times, so that we could compare the spectral data that we gathered with any paints or pigments, since obviously many people believed particularly at that point in time, that the shroud must be some form of artwork. So we looked for the paints and pigments that might prove or disprove that. Of course, we found none.
Extensive research was done to find the nature of the shroud and the paint or method used for creating the shroud. The Middle Ages had been rife with duplicates, hoaxes, and fake artifacts for monetary gain of influence. The theory was that this was one of the more successful pieces. The hunt was on to find the details of its creation and prove this to be true scientifically.
Once we collected the data and evaluated it, we don't know of a mechanism that can make an image with the properties that are on the shroud. So in effect, we failed. Instead of coming back with the answers to how the image was formed, the best we could do was come back to tell you what it's not. It's not a painting, we've proven that. It's not a scorch, we've proven that, and it's not a photograph. So we have eliminated 3 of the most prominent theories of the shroud, but in the end, we really failed in being able to determine a mechanism, because we don't know of any mechanism. To this day, in the most image-oriented era of human history, we know of no mechanism that can make an image with the chemical and physical properties of the shroud.
According to these findings, no human was responsible for the creation of this artifact. Independent groups managed to recreate a similar imprint, but those involved far too elaborate and technologically advanced methods or processes. Much of the details that were found and seem to be proof of its authenticity are far too elaborate for someone to have created to be found 600 years later. There were discrepancies between the shroud and the medieval portrayal of Jesus' crucifixion as well. It would have been futile to create a false artifact so opposed to the established ideas of the time.
Most Christian art would show the crucifixion through the palm, but this takes place lower down on the hand. And a surgeon called Pierre Barbet tried to establish why that's the case. And so he did various experiments and realised that the palm doesn't hold the weight of a body, but this area holds it very well. And what's interesting, if you nail somebody in this place, you damage the median nerve and the thumb goes in. You don't see any thumbs on the Shroud of Turin.
Hardly any artistic creation can be found that backs up the shroud in this sense. Yet some information can be found, which are in conflict with the most popular belief and evidence found in the Middle Ages. A Hungarian text, the Prey manuscript, named after Georgi Prey, a Hungarian Jesuit historian who discovered it in the 18th century, is one of these. It has been dated to the 12th century, a century prior to the carbon dating of the shroud. The manuscript itself has great value in that it is the earliest found prose in Hungarian, yet to the adherents of the authenticity of the shroud, something else has far greater value. Contained within the text, an illustration with very familiar marks and symbols can be found. It is the depiction of the Entombment of Jesus. Remarkably, the position of the body is exactly as it is found on the shroud. It is laid out straight, and the hands are clasped at the front, just as they are on the shroud. The thumbs are tucked in, just as they were on the shroud, and would be considered physiologically correct in the case of nailed wrists. In the Middle Ages, the widely held belief was that Jesus was nailed to the cross through the hands. Nailed wrists were not, therefore, a commonly held belief. Beneath that is a scene of the resurrection, with a depiction of the burial cloth. A magnification of the weave of the shroud has been painted. The weave, a herringbone design, is identical to the one of the shroud. Further, burn holes have been included onto the cloth, which are in the shape of an L, the very same that are found on the actual shroud itself. This is remarkable, since this is one of the very few artifacts that explicitly identify these marks on the shroud. It makes very clear reference to an existing object. Otherwise, what would have been the need of depicting the burn holes, especially as the shroud would have been mostly unharmed at the time of the burial itself? The Shroud of Turin old cloth has often pitted believer against believer and scientist against scientist. Yet many of its mysteries remain hidden to this day. How was the image created, and how has it preserved? There are still many questions to be answered, and every new discovery introduces even more factors and aspects. Though we can cautiously say that the experimentation of 1988 may have been correctly done, but failed to uncover the whole truth behind the shroud. For the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat, this shroud would hold a great significance. As Hazur Aqdas explains.
आया कि एक वाहिद हज़रत सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि वसल्लम से पहले के ज़माने में जो पुराने अम्बिया हैं उनमें से एक वाहिद नबी है जिसकी असल बाकी तुम लोग अक्सी तस्वीरें बना लेते हैं ना, हम तो मुसलमान तो बनाना नहीं चाहते क्योंकि मना है प्रिंट करके नक्शे खींच के स्केच करके तस्वीर बनाना किसी की सिर्फ तसव्वुर के ऊपर। तो एक वाहिद नबी है जिसको अल्लाह ताला ने जिसकी तस्वीर महफूज कर ली है इसके ज़रिए से, और ये एक ऐसा कपड़ा है मुक़द्दस जिससे एक तारीख़ की शवायत भी मिलते हैं और नबी की तस्वीर भी मिलती है जो 2000 साल पहले पैदा हुआ था। तो यही थी कि अल्लाह यहाँ कुदरत किस तरह संभाल के रखा हुआ है, और इसलिए संभाल के रखा हुआ कि बाद में जब मसीह आसानी आएगा तो उस ज़माने में फिर असल हकीकत और सबूत मिल जाए और जो गलत नज़रियात हैं लोगों के वो ख़त्म हो सकें।
How the Shroud of Turin came about may always remain a mystery, but its existence and possible preservation to this day would be the proof of God's greatness. The Shroud of Turin may provide evidence for a deciding moment in the life of the prophet Jesus. Yet, regardless of whether it is real or fake, it does not retract from the status of Jesus as a prophet, chosen by God for his mission.